He should not have felt it through the bond, not that fast. The words echoed inside Dominic Blackwell's mind like a warning he arrived too late to stop. The forest outside Whitmore Valley was quiet, but his instincts were anything but calm. Every step he took toward the small cabin ahead carried a pressure he could not fully name. Something beneath authority, beneath control, something closer to raw instinct reacting before thought could intervene. Inside the cabin, Claire Whitmore moved without knowing any of this. She stood near the small bathroom threshold, wrapped in the soft light of late afternoon filtering through wooden blinds, unaware that the simple act she was preparing to take would ripple through a connection she had never been taught to understand. Near the open window, a black wolf remained still, watching the tree line with a patience that did not belong to ordinary nature. It had appeared days ago without warning, and Claire had not feared it. Instead, she had done something far more dangerous in the world she did not yet know existed. She had trusted it. "You can stay here," Claire had said earlier, her voice soft, as if speaking to something fragile rather than wild. "Just keep watch." The wolf had not moved then. It did not move now. But in the unseen distance between places and awareness, something in Dominic Blackwell tightened violently the moment that memory crossed through the bond field he could not fully control. He stopped walking. His hand pressed briefly against the rough bark of a tree, not for balance, but because stillness was the only thing preventing reaction from becoming visible. "Why is she alone with it?" he muttered, though the question was not meant for anyone present. The bond did not answer with words. It answered with sensation. A shift, a presence, a proximity that should not have been interpreted the way it was being interpreted. Yet instinct did not care for logic. Inside the cabin, Claire stepped closer to the small bathroom doorway, her movements unhurried, completely unaware of the pressure forming beyond her world. The wolf's ears tilted slightly, tracking something she could not perceive. Not danger. Not threat. Something closer to recognition. Dominic continued forward again, slower now, as if every step required negotiation between authority and instinct. He was the Alpha King, and yet what he felt in that moment did not respond to titles. It responded to connection. "She should not be doing this alone," he said again, quieter this time, as if repetition might stabilize meaning. But what unsettled him was not her solitude. It was what her solitude meant in proximity to something bonded. The black wolf was not supposed to be there in the way it was there. Not near her, not watching over her, not responding as if her presence defined its position in space. The bond reacted again. Sharper, closer. Dominic's jaw tightened. His control remained intact, but only just. He saw it now, not physically, but in instinctive alignment. Claire Whitmore, unaware, trusting, standing at the edge of vulnerability without realizing she was not alone in perception anymore. And the wolf, not acting as an animal, but as a reflection of something deeper in the system he had spent his entire existence controlling. "No," he said under his breath, though the word carried no clear target. Inside the cabin, Claire finally paused, her hand resting near the doorframe, as if sensing something she could not explain. The wolf turned its head slightly toward her, calm, unwavering. And in that same instant, Dominic Blackwell stepped out from the forest line, his presence arriving not with sound, but with certainty that changed the atmosphere before either of them saw him. The bond had already spoken, and he had already heard too much. The moment Dominic Blackwell stepped out of the forest line, the entire atmosphere around the cabin changed in a way that could not be explained by sight alone. It was not noise that announced him. It was pressure, subtle but absolute, as if the air itself had acknowledged a shift in hierarchy before anyone inside the cabin consciously registered it. Claire Whitmore stood near the bathroom threshold, her hand still lightly touching the wooden frame, unaware that the stillness she had been living in for days had just fractured into something far more complicated. The black wolf, however, reacted before she did. Its head lifted slightly, not in alarm, but in recognition of something that carried weight beyond instinct. Dominic's gaze locked onto the cabin instantly. Through the open doorway, he saw Claire first, calm, unaware, and then he saw the wolf beside her. That single image was enough to make something inside his control tighten again. Not break, not yet, but tighten. "You brought it inside," Dominic said, his voice low, not loud enough to startle, but sharp enough to define distance immediately. Claire turned toward the sound, her expression shifting from calm confusion to alert awareness. She had not expected anyone else, especially not him. "I did not bring anything," she replied carefully, her voice steady but questioning. It was already here. Dominic stepped closer, just one pace into the edge of the cabin threshold, and immediately stopped. Not because he was unsure, but because crossing further felt like crossing into something already active. His attention did not leave the wolf. "That is not just something," he said. The wolf remained still, but its focus was now fully aligned with him. Claire looked between them, confusion beginning to rise again, but this time it carried a different weight. Not fear. Awareness of tension she could not name. "It stayed," she said quietly, almost as if defending the fact rather than explaining it. "It did not harm anything. It just watched." Dominic's jaw tightened slightly. The bond reacted again, sharper this time, like a pulse beneath perception that refused to be ignored. He exhaled slowly, forcing control back into place. "Watching is not the issue," he said. His gaze finally shifted from the wolf to Claire. "Proximity is." Claire frowned slightly, her head tilting as she processed the word. "Proximity to what?" she asked. The silence that followed was immediate and heavy. Dominic did not answer right away, not because he lacked one, but because any answer carried consequences she was not prepared to interpret. The wolf moved then, not forward aggressively, not backward, only repositioning itself so that it stood slightly closer to Claire again, as if her presence was the center of its alignment. Dominic saw it instantly. Something in his expression changed, not into anger, but into restrained reaction that had to be contained before it became visible. "Do not stand near it like that," he said finally. Claire blinked. "Near it like what?" she asked. Dominic's voice lowered further. "Like it belongs there." That sentence shifted the room in a way neither of them could ignore. Claire went still for a moment, her gaze dropping briefly to the wolf, then back to him. "It has not caused any harm," she said quietly. "It has been here without trouble." Dominic stepped slightly farther inside now, though still maintaining control over his distance. His presence filled more of the space, but not in a way that pushed physically. It altered perception. "You are not seeing what it is doing," he said. The wolf's ears flicked once, subtle but precise, as if acknowledging language it understood on a level deeper than sound. Claire took a small breath, her confusion now layered with something else. "Then tell me," she said. "What is it doing?" Dominic looked at her for a long moment, and for the first time, his composure showed something beneath it. Not weakness, not anger, something closer to conflict between instinct and restraint. "It is responding to you," he said finally, in a way that should not be possible without a bond. The word landed differently in the room. Claire did not understand it fully, but she felt its weight immediately. The wolf remained still. Dominic remained still. And in the space between all three of them, something unspoken tightened further, as if the truth was no longer approaching. It had already arrived. The word bond did not fade after it was spoken. It remained in the air like something structural, something that had always existed but had only now been given language. Inside the cabin, Claire Whitmore stood still for a moment longer than she intended, her attention shifting between Dominic Blackwell and the Black Wolf as if both were now part of the same equation she had not learned how to solve. Dominic's presence filled the space in a way that did not feel physical alone. It felt directional, as if the room itself had adjusted its awareness to his arrival. The wolf, however, did not move. It remained exactly where it was, watching him with a stillness that was no longer passive. It was recognition without permission. Claire finally broke the silence, her voice quieter now, but no longer uncertain. "You keep saying that word," she said carefully. "Bond." Dominic did not respond immediately. His gaze remained fixed on the wolf, as if the answer was not something he needed to construct, but something already confirmed. "It is not a word," he said at last. "It is a condition." Claire frowned slightly. "A condition of what?" she asked. The silence that followed this time was different. It was not hesitation. It was containment. Dominic stepped further into the cabin, stopping just enough to remain within the threshold, but no longer at its edge. The distance he kept was deliberate, not from caution, but from control. Of recognition between two systems that were never meant to operate separately, he said. Claire's expression tightened slightly as she processed the phrasing. Systems, she repeated quietly. You are talking like this is something technical. Dominic's eyes finally shifted from the wolf to her. It is not emotional first, he said. It becomes emotional later. The wolf shifted its weight again, subtle but intentional, and this time Claire noticed something she had not before. It did not respond to sound. It responded to presence. To him. To her. To something between them that did not require movement to be acknowledged. So what does that mean for it? Claire asked, nodding slightly toward the wolf. Dominic's expression changed only slightly, but enough to signal that the answer carried weight. It means it should not be here in that form without alignment, he said. Claire's eyes narrowed slightly. But it is here, she said. And it has not harmed anything. Dominic paused again, and for a moment, the air between them felt tighter, not from tension alone, but from something like restraint being actively maintained. You are evaluating it from your perspective, he said finally, not from what it is responding to. Claire looked at him more directly now. And what is it responding to, she asked. The wolf turned its head slightly toward her at that exact moment, as if the question itself had changed something in the room. Dominic saw it. Claire felt it. Neither of them spoke immediately after. When Dominic finally answered, his voice was lower than before. You. Claire blinked once, not in disbelief, but in an attempt to understand the structure of the statement rather than its surface meaning. That is not possible, she said quietly. Dominic did not correct her immediately. Instead, he looked at the wolf again. It should not be possible without a binding link, he said. Claire exhaled slowly. Then explain the link, she said. For the first time since he arrived, Dominic hesitated, not in uncertainty, but in selection, choosing how much reality could be introduced without destabilizing what was already forming in front of them. The wolf stepped forward slightly, not toward Dominic, not away from Claire, only into a position where neither of them could ignore its presence as central rather than peripheral. Dominic noticed immediately. His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. It is responding faster than expected, he said under his breath, more to himself than to her. Claire caught the words. Faster than expected by who? She asked. Dominic's gaze lifted to hers again. By anyone who understands what it is tied to, he said. The room fell into another silence. But this one was no longer empty. It was structured, as if every presence inside it now occupied a defined role they had not agreed upon but could no longer avoid. Claire slowly turned her head toward the wolf again, her expression softer now, but deeply focused. So it is not just a stray, she said quietly. Dominic did not answer immediately. When he did, his voice carried something controlled but unmistakably certain. No, he said. It is not stray at all. And in that moment, the cabin no longer felt like a place where three separate beings were interacting. It felt like a single system had begun to recognize itself through them, whether they were ready or not. The cabin no longer felt like a simple structure made of wood and silence. It felt occupied by something far more unstable, as if every presence inside it had begun to influence the shape of the moment itself. Claire Whitmore stood between Dominic Blackwell and the Black Wolf without moving. Not because she was afraid, but because she could feel that movement now carried meaning she had not been taught to interpret. The word bond still lingered in the space like a pressure point neither of them had fully addressed. Dominic remained still, his posture controlled, but the stillness was no longer natural. It was maintained. The wolf did not break eye contact with him, and that alone was enough to shift the emotional geometry of the room. Claire finally spoke, her voice quiet but steady. If it is not a stray, she said slowly, then what is it? Dominic did not answer immediately. His gaze remained on the wolf, not in observation anymore, but in calculation layered with instinct. When he finally spoke, his voice was lower than before. It is an extension of response, he said. Claire blinked slightly. That does not explain anything, she replied. Dominic turned his attention briefly toward her, and for the first time since entering the cabin, his control showed a subtle strain. Not breaking, but flexing under pressure it did not usually encounter. It does not exist independently in the way you are interpreting it, he said. It reacts to alignment. The wolf shifted again, one step forward, slow and deliberate, stopping at a distance that did not feel accidental. Claire noticed it this time not as movement, but as intention. Alignment with what? She asked. The silence that followed was heavier than before. Dominic's jaw tightened briefly, as if choosing whether truth would stabilize or escalate what was already forming. With you, he said finally. Claire's expression did not change immediately, but something in her focus sharpened. Not disbelief. Processing. That is the second time you have said something like that, she said. And I still do not understand what it means in a real sense. Dominic exhaled slowly through his nose, not frustration, but controlled pressure release. Then understand it this way, he said. It does not decide what it is doing. It reflects what it is connected to. Claire looked at the wolf again. This time, she saw something different in its stillness. Not obedience, not neutrality, something closer to synchronization, as if it was waiting for acknowledgement rather than instruction. And what does it reflect from me? She asked quietly. Dominic did not answer immediately. The room seemed to contract slightly around the question, not physically, but in attention. Even the wolf's posture changed subtly, as if the question itself altered its reference point. When Dominic finally spoke, his voice was lower, more precise. It reflects what you are not yet aware you are emitting, he said. Claire frowned slightly. That sounds impossible, she said. Dominic's gaze remained steady. It is not impossible, he replied. It is simply not visible in the way you are used to understanding things. The wolf stepped once more, closer to Claire than before, stopping again without crossing any boundary that could be defined as threat or intrusion. It did not press. It aligned. Dominic saw it immediately, and for the first time, something in his expression shifted beyond control. Not into loss of control, but into recognition of escalation. It is responding too precisely, he said under his breath. Claire turned slightly toward him. Too precisely for what? She asked. Dominic paused. When he answered, his words were measured, but the weight behind them was undeniable. For something that is supposed to be random, Claire's attention shifted between them again, her understanding no longer anchored in normal explanation. So you are saying it is not random, she said slowly. Dominic did not correct her. The silence that followed was no longer neutral. It was anticipatory, as if something had already begun transitioning from observation into consequence without announcing itself. The wolf remained between them, but not as barrier, as indicator. And in that quiet cabin, nothing felt separate anymore. Not presence, not instinct, and not the truth that was slowly becoming impossible to ignore. The air inside the cabin felt thinner now, not because anything physical had changed, but because meaning itself was becoming harder to contain. Claire Whitmore stood in the same place she had been moments before, yet everything around her felt slightly restructured, as if the conversation had altered the rules of what could be considered normal. Dominic Blackwell remained still, but his stillness was no longer passive. It was containment. The black wolf, positioned between them, did not move at all this time. Not because it was uncertain, but because nothing in its environment required adjustment anymore. Claire finally broke the silence, her voice quieter than before, but sharpened by the weight of accumulation rather than confusion alone. You keep saying it reacts, she said slowly, but it feels like you are describing it as if it has awareness beyond instinct. Dominic did not answer immediately. His gaze remained fixed on the wolf, but his attention was divided in a way that suggested he was processing more than what was visible. It does not have awareness in the way you define awareness, he said finally. Claire frowned slightly. Then how does it choose where to stand? She asked. The question lingered longer than expected. Dominic exhaled once, controlled and measured. It does not choose, he said. It aligns. Claire repeated the word under her breath. Aligns, she said. With what? Dominic's expression tightened subtly, not from discomfort, but from the precision of the question itself. With connection patterns that exist before conscious interpretation, he replied. Claire looked at the wolf again, her focus shifting now from confusion to observation. The wolf's posture had not changed, yet its presence felt increasingly defined, as if its stillness was no longer absence of motion but confirmation of position. That still does not explain why it is here, she said. Dominic finally shifted his gaze toward her. The weight of his attention was steady, not aggressive, but absolute in focus. It is here because it has not separated what it is responding to from what it is observing, he said. Claire paused. And what is it observing? She asked. The silence that followed was not empty. It was layered, as if multiple conclusions were being restrained from collapsing into speech at once. Dominic's voice lowered slightly when he answered. You, he said. Claire did not react immediately. Not because she did not hear him, but because the simplicity of the answer did not match the complexity of everything leading up to it. That is not possible in the way you are describing, she said carefully. Dominic did not challenge her. Instead, he took one slow step further into the cabin, stopping at a distance that reduced the space between presence and interpretation without eliminating it entirely. Then you are assuming separation that is not actually present, he said. The wolf shifted its head slightly toward Claire, not abruptly, but with intention that felt like acknowledgement rather than reaction. Claire noticed it this time differently, not as movement, but as confirmation of continuity. So this is not just a creature staying nearby, she said slowly. Dominic's expression remained controlled, but something beneath it sharpened. It is not functioning as an independent variable, he said. Claire looked back at him. That sounds like you are saying it is part of something else, she replied. Dominic did not deny it. The silence that followed became denser, as if the room itself was compressing around an idea that had not yet fully surfaced. Claire's voice lowered slightly. And I am somehow connected to that something else, she said. Dominic's response was immediate, but carefully restrained. You are not connected to it, he said. You are the reference point it is responding to. The words did not land as explanation. They landed as shift. Claire looked down briefly, then back at the wolf, her expression now less confused and more reflective, as if she was trying to locate where her understanding had begun to drift away from what was familiar. And you are here because of that, she said, turning back to Dominic. He did not answer immediately, and that silence became its own confirmation. The wolf remained between them, no longer acting as interruption or anomaly, but as confirmation of a structure neither of them had fully acknowledged yet. And in that stillness, the cabin no longer felt like a place where questions were being asked. It felt like a place where answers were already present, waiting for recognition rather than discovery. The silence that followed Claire Whitmore's last words did not feel empty anymore. It felt structured, as if every sentence spoken inside the cabin had begun building something beneath the surface that none of them could fully step outside of. Dominic Blackwell stood still, but his stillness now carried the weight of restraint layered over recognition. The black wolf remained between them, unchanged in posture, yet increasingly central in meaning, as if its presence had shifted from observation to confirmation. Claire's gaze moved slowly between them again, no longer searching for explanation in single statements, but trying to understand the pattern behind them. So everything you are saying leads back to me, she said quietly. Dominic did not respond immediately. His attention remained split between the wolf and her, but not in conflict. In assessment, it does not lead back, he said finally. It originates from you. Claire's expression tightened slightly, not in fear, but in the strain of processing something that did not match her previous understanding of reality. That does not make sense in any normal structure, she replied. Dominic's voice remained even. Normal structure is not what you are inside of right now. The wolf shifted its weight subtly again, not stepping forward or back, but adjusting its orientation toward Claire as if confirming alignment once more. She noticed it more clearly now, not as movement, but as response. And you are saying this thing, she said carefully, is reacting to something inside me that I am not aware of. Dominic's gaze sharpened slightly. Yes, he said. The word was simple, but the space after it was not. Claire exhaled slowly, her eyes lowering for a brief moment before returning to the wolf. I have never experienced anything like this before, she admitted quietly. Dominic's expression softened only in restraint, not emotion. Because you were never placed in proximity to what responds to you in this way, he said. The phrasing made Claire pause. Placed, she repeated. Dominic nodded slightly. Proximity is not accidental here, he said. It is directional. The cabin felt smaller in that moment, not physically, but perceptually, as if the space between them had become more defined by meaning than distance. Claire took a small step to the side, not away from them, but into a different alignment within the room. The wolf tracked the movement instantly, not with urgency, but with continuity. Dominic noticed it immediately. His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. It is still following your shifts, he said under his breath. Claire looked at him. Following, she asked. Dominic corrected himself slightly. Responding, he said. Claire turned her attention back to the wolf again, her confusion now replaced by something more focused. Then it is not independent, she said slowly. Dominic did not answer immediately. When he did, his voice carried controlled certainty. Not in the way you define independence, he said. Claire frowned slightly. Then what defines it? She asked. The silence that followed was longer this time, not because the answer was unclear, but because the answer carried implications that extended beyond the cabin itself. Dominic finally spoke. Connection, he said. Claire repeated the word softly. Connection to me, she said. Dominic did not correct her. That absence of correction was more revealing than confirmation. The wolf shifted again, its posture steady, but its attention unwavering. Claire noticed something new this time. Not threat, not comfort. Recognition without language. So what happens now? She asked quietly. If I do not understand what this connection is. Dominic stepped slightly forward again, closing the space just enough to change the weight of his presence without overwhelming it. You are already part of it, he said. Claire looked at him directly now. And you have been aware of this the entire time, she said. Dominic held her gaze. Yes, he answered. The word did not carry justification. It carried fact. The cabin remained still, but the stillness no longer felt neutral. It felt like structure settling into place, as if the question was no longer whether a connection existed, but how long it would take before it could no longer be ignored by any of them. The cabin felt quieter now, but not in the way silence usually settles after conversation ends. This was a different kind of quiet, one that seemed to hold all the words that had already been spoken and refused to let them disappear. Claire Whitmore stood where she had been, her posture steady but no longer passive. Something in her awareness had changed, not through understanding, but through accumulation. Each statement from Dominic Blackwell had layered itself into a structure she could feel but not fully define. The black wolf remained in the same position, yet its presence no longer felt like an external element in the room. It felt integrated, as if it belonged to the same system of awareness that Dominic was describing. Claire finally spoke again, her voice measured but no longer uncertain. If I am part of this connection, she said slowly, then why am I only hearing about it now? Dominic did not respond immediately. His gaze remained steady, not on her alone, but on the balance between her and the wolf, as if both were variables in a system he had been monitoring longer than he had admitted. Because awareness does not arrive at the same time as reality, he said finally. Claire frowned slightly. That sounds like avoidance of the question, she replied. Dominic's expression did not change, but something in his tone sharpened slightly. It is not avoidance, he said. It is sequence. The word lingered. Claire repeated it quietly. Sequence, she said. The wolf shifted its head slightly toward her voice, not reacting emotionally, but responding as if her speech itself altered something in its internal alignment. Claire noticed it more clearly now. Not as behavior, as reaction. You keep saying it responds to me, she said, but it does not feel like response in the way I understand it. Dominic stepped slightly closer, though still maintaining deliberate distance. Then your understanding is incomplete, he said. Claire looked at him directly. And you are certain yours is not, she replied. For the first time, Dominic paused, not in hesitation, but in evaluation of how much truth could be expressed without destabilizing what was already forming in the room. My understanding is not complete, he said finally, but it is further along the sequence. Claire absorbed that quietly, her attention shifting again toward the wolf. The animal remained still, but its stillness no longer felt neutral. It felt directed, as if every part of it was aware of positioning without requiring instruction. So what is the sequence leading to, she asked. Dominic's eyes remained on her now. Recognition, he said. Claire blinked slightly. Recognition of what exactly? She asked. The silence that followed was heavier than before, not because of uncertainty, but because the answer carried implications that extended beyond language. Dominic finally spoke. Of what you are within it, he said. Claire's expression tightened slightly. And what I am within it is something you have known all along, she said. Dominic did not deny it. That absence of denial carried more weight than confirmation. The wolf stepped forward one measured pace, then stopped again, as if marking a boundary that existed only in perception. Claire's gaze followed it. It keeps doing that, she said softly. Dominic responded immediately. It does not keep doing anything, he said. It is adjusting to you. Claire turned her attention back to him. Adjusting in what way? She asked. Dominic's answer was precise. In accordance with what you are emitting without awareness. Claire exhaled slowly, her focus narrowing now not in confusion, but in deeper attempt to understand structure rather than explanation. Then I am not just being observed, she said quietly. Dominic's gaze sharpened slightly. No, he said. You are being read. The words settled into the cabin differently than anything before it. Not as threat, not as comfort, as definition. Claire looked at the wolf again, then back at Dominic, her voice quieter now. And what happens when I am fully read? She asked. According to this sequence you keep referring to? Dominic held her gaze for a moment longer than before. The wolf did not move. The cabin did not shift. But something in the atmosphere aligned into a sharper clarity, as if the question itself had reached the next stage of something irreversible. Then, Dominic said slowly, there is no longer separation between what you are and what is responding to you. And in that moment, the silence that followed was no longer empty. It was waiting. The cabin no longer felt like a place where three separate entities were sharing space. It felt like a single system that had begun to reveal itself layer by layer, with each conversation stripping away the illusion that anything inside it was truly independent. Claire Whitmore stood in the center of that shifting awareness, her expression now quieter, not because she understood everything, but because she was beginning to understand that understanding itself might not be the correct starting point. Dominic Blackwell remained still, but his stillness was no longer simple control. It was containment over something that was constantly reacting beneath perception. The black wolf did not move, yet its presence felt increasingly integrated into the structure of the room, as if it was no longer an observer but a stabilizing point within an unseen alignment. Claire finally spoke, her voice lower than before. If there is no separation, she said slowly, then why does it feel like I am only just becoming aware of something that has always existed? Dominic did not answer immediately. His gaze remained steady, not on her alone, but on the interaction between her awareness and the wolf's response pattern, as if both were variables converging toward a single point. Because awareness is not origin, he said finally. It is delay. Claire frowned slightly. That does not make it easier to understand, she replied. Dominic's expression did not change, but his tone sharpened subtly. It is not meant to be easy, he said. It is meant to be accurate. The wolf shifted its posture again, not stepping forward this time, but subtly adjusting its orientation toward Claire, as if her emotional focus had altered its internal reference. Claire noticed it more clearly now, not as movement, but as response timing. It reacts before I even finish thinking sometimes, she said quietly. Dominic nodded once. Yes, he said, because it is not waiting for thought. Claire looked at him more directly now. Then what is it waiting for? She asked. Dominic paused briefly, not in hesitation, but in precision. Resonance, he said. The words settled into the room differently than the others. Claire repeated it under her breath. Resonance, she said. The wolf's head tilted slightly, not toward Dominic, but toward Claire again, as if confirming that the word itself had structural meaning. Claire stepped back half a pace without realizing it, then stopped, noticing how even her smallest movement was reflected in the wolf's orientation. So everything I do is being reflected back, she said slowly. Dominic corrected her immediately. Not reflected, he said. Interpreted. Claire's gaze tightened slightly. That sounds like the same thing with different language, she replied. Dominic's eyes met hers directly now. It is not the same, he said. Reflection is passive. Interpretation is active. The silence that followed was no longer confusion. It was recalibration. Claire exhaled slowly, her attention shifting between Dominic and the wolf again, as if she was no longer trying to understand what they were, but what system they were operating within. And I am part of this interpretation, she said quietly. Dominic did not deny it. That absence of denial was heavier than affirmation. The wolf moved again, one small adjustment forward, stopping just within the same invisible boundary it had respected since Dominic arrived. Claire noticed something else now. The movement was not repetitive. It was responsive to her attention itself, not her actions. It changes when I focus on it, she said. Dominic nodded slightly. Yes, he said, because focus is input. Claire looked at him sharply. So, I am influencing it without meaning to, she said. Dominic's response was immediate. You are influencing everything within its range, he said. The statement did not feel like escalation. It felt like clarification of scale. Claire turned her head slightly toward the wolf again, her expression now more controlled than uncertain. And it has always been this way, she said. Dominic's voice lowered slightly. Yes, he said again. Claire was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke again, her voice carried something more grounded, not fully acceptance, but alignment toward recognition. Then the question is not what it is, she said slowly, but what I am to it. Dominic held her gaze for a moment longer than before. The wolf remained still, but the air between them felt increasingly defined by something none of them could step outside of anymore. That, Dominic said finally, is exactly the question the system is already answering. And in that moment, nothing in the cabin moved, yet everything inside it felt like it had already begun to change direction. The stillness inside the cabin was no longer neutral. It had become directional, as if every presence within it was being gently guided toward an understanding that had not yet fully formed into language. Claire Whitmore stood at the center of that shift, her awareness no longer moving in confusion, but in gradual alignment with something she could feel rather than define. Dominic Blackwell remained where he was, but his presence now carried a different weight, not just authority, but restraint shaped by constant internal response. The black wolf stood between them as it had before, yet it no longer felt like an external anomaly. It felt integrated into a larger structure that none of them were observing from the outside anymore. Claire finally spoke, her voice quieter, but more focused than before. You keep saying system, she said slowly, but it sounds like you are describing something that includes more than just us in this room. Dominic did not respond immediately. His gaze remained steady, but not fixed on a single point. It moved between Claire and the wolf as if measuring interaction rather than position. It is not limited to this room, he said finally. Claire frowned slightly. Then what is the boundary? She asked. Dominic exhaled once, controlled, as if selecting the least disruptive way to express something already stable in his understanding. There is no clear boundary, he said. Claire paused at that, her expression tightening slightly. That does not sound possible, she replied. Dominic's voice remained even. It is not about possibility, he said. It is about recognition. The wolf shifted its stance again, subtle and precise, not changing position significantly, but adjusting orientation in a way that felt responsive to something unspoken between Claire and Dominic. Claire noticed it immediately this time, not as movement, but as confirmation of timing. It reacts to my attention, she said quietly. Dominic nodded once. Yes, he said, and to your uncertainty. Claire looked at him more directly now. So it is not just responding to actions, she said. Dominic corrected her gently, but firmly. It is responding to state, he said. The words settled into the room with more weight than expected. Claire repeated it softly. State, she said. She looked down briefly, as if trying to locate that concept within herself rather than within explanation. And what state am I in that it is reacting to? She asked. Dominic did not answer immediately. When he did, his voice lowered slightly. Unresolved awareness, he said. Claire exhaled slowly. That sounds like I am doing something without knowing I am doing it, she replied. Dominic's gaze remained steady. That is exactly what is happening, he said. The wolf stepped forward again, but only slightly, stopping at a distance that remained consistent with all previous movements, as if it was refining position rather than changing it. Claire turned her attention toward it again, and for a brief moment, something subtle changed in her expression. Not understanding, but recognition of pattern. It does not feel like it is separate anymore, she said quietly. Dominic responded without delay. It was never separate in function, he said. Claire looked back at him. Then why did it feel separate before? She asked. Dominic paused briefly, then answered. Because perception requires delay to interpret alignment, he said. Claire frowned slightly. That is becoming harder to follow, she admitted. Dominic's expression softened only slightly, not emotionally, but in recognition of threshold being approached. You are approaching synchronization, he said. Claire repeated the word under her breath. Synchronization, she said. The wolf's ears shifted subtly, not reacting outwardly, but registering the word in a way that changed its stillness. Claire noticed that too. It understands that, she said quietly. Dominic nodded once. It does not understand language, he said. It understands structure behind language. Claire looked between them again, her attention now less fragmented and more continuous. And I am part of that structure, she said. Dominic did not correct her. That absence of correction carried more clarity than affirmation. Claire exhaled slowly. So what happens when synchronization completes? She asked. The question changed the atmosphere immediately, not through tension, but through focus. Dominic's gaze sharpened slightly, but his voice remained controlled. Completion is not an end state, he said. Claire frowned. Then what is it? She asked. Dominic held her gaze for a moment longer than before. It is recognition without resistance, he said. The wolf shifted again, almost imperceptibly, but this time its position felt final rather than exploratory. Claire stood very still, absorbing the weight of that idea not as concept, but as implication. So I am not learning something new, she said slowly. I am remembering something I did not know I had already been part of. Dominic did not respond immediately. When he did, his voice was quiet, but absolute in its certainty. Yes, he said. The cabin remained still, but the stillness now felt different. Not empty, not waiting. It felt like a structure reaching the point where it no longer required explanation to continue existing. The word recognition lingered in the cabin long after Dominic Blackwell had spoken it, not as sound anymore, but as structure, as if it had settled into the space between all three presences and refused to dissolve. Claire Whitmore stood very still now, not because she was overwhelmed, but because her awareness had reached a point where movement felt unnecessary, as if even her smallest decision would carry meaning she could no longer ignore. Dominic remained in the same position, his posture controlled, but his attention no longer divided between observation and reaction. It was focused now, as if he had reached the final stage of interpreting something that had been building long before this moment. The black wolf stood between them, and for the first time since the beginning of their interaction, it did not shift its position at all. Not because it had stopped responding, but because nothing around it required adjustment anymore. Claire finally spoke, her voice quieter than before, but no longer uncertain. If what you are saying is true, she said slowly, then there was never a moment where I was outside of this. Dominic did not answer immediately. His gaze remained steady, but there was no longer calculation in it. It was confirmation. There was no outside position, he said finally. Claire frowned slightly, not in disagreement, but in the effort of aligning language with something she could feel, but not yet fully structure. Then everything I thought was separate, she said, was never actually separate at all. Dominic nodded once. Separation was only perception lag, he said. The wolf shifted its head slightly at that exact moment, not reacting to the words themselves, but to the stabilization of meaning in the environment. Claire noticed it immediately, not as behavior, but as synchronization. It reacts less now, she said quietly. Dominic corrected her gently. It is not reacting less, he said. It is no longer differentiating. Claire repeated the phrase under her breath. No longer differentiating, she said. She looked at the wolf again, and this time her expression carried something different. Not confusion, not fear. Something closer to acceptance of pattern she had not yet fully named. So this is what you meant by recognition, she said, turning slightly back toward Dominic. Not understanding something new, but realizing there was never separation to begin with. Dominic held her gaze for a moment longer than before. Yes, he said. The word was simple, but it did not require expansion anymore. Claire exhaled slowly, her shoulders lowering slightly, as if something internal had stopped resisting its own structure. And the wolf, she said carefully, glancing toward it again, is part of that same system. Dominic nodded. It has always been part of it, he said. Claire frowned slightly. Even before I was aware of it, she said. Dominic's answer came without hesitation. Especially before, he said. The silence that followed was no longer heavy. It was aligned. The wolf took one final subtle adjustment in stance, then became completely still again. But this time the stillness did not feel like waiting or observation. It felt like completion of positioning within a structure that had finally stabilized. Claire stood quietly for a long moment, her gaze moving between the wolf and Dominic, not searching for explanation anymore, but confirming continuity. So what changes now? She asked softly. If everything is already part of the same structure? Dominic's expression remained steady, but his voice lowered slightly, as if the answer did not belong to interpretation anymore. Now, he said, you begin to perceive it without delay. Claire absorbed the words without resistance this time, not because she fully understood them, but because she no longer needed to oppose them to consider them real. The cabin remained still, but it no longer felt like a space holding three separate presences. It felt like a single awareness that had finally stopped fragmenting itself into different forms of recognition. The cabin no longer felt like a place where something was being discovered. It felt like a place where something had already been established, and all that remained was the gradual human realization of its structure. Claire Whitmore stood in the same position she had occupied moments before, but her stillness now carried a different quality. It was no longer uncertainty or hesitation. It was absorption, as if her awareness had finally stopped resisting the framework forming around her and had begun to move with it instead. Dominic Blackwell remained where he was, his presence steady, controlled, and no longer divided between observation and internal response. The Black Wolf stood between them, unchanged in posture, yet no longer functioning as a separate focal point. It felt integrated into the same field of awareness that now included both of them. Claire finally spoke, her voice softer than before, but more continuous, as if she was no longer interrupting thought, but following it as it formed. If I am perceiving without delay now, she said slowly, then why does it feel like everything I understood before is still trying to stay in place? Dominic did not respond immediately. His gaze remained steady, not on her alone, but on the alignment between her perception and the wolf's stillness, as if both were confirming the same stage of transition. Because prior structure does not disappear immediately, he said finally. It resists replacement until recognition becomes complete. Claire frowned slightly, not in disagreement, but in processing the persistence of older frameworks within new awareness. So I am overlapping two ways of seeing at the same time, she said quietly. Dominic nodded once. Yes, he said. The wolf shifted its head slightly at that exact moment, not as reaction, but as synchronization confirmation, as if Claire's verbalization had stabilized a previously fluctuating internal state. Claire noticed it immediately. It responds even to understanding, she said. Dominic corrected her gently. It responds to coherence, he said. Claire repeated the word under her breath. Coherence, she said. She looked at the wolf again, and this time her expression carried something more grounded than before. Not confusion, not curiosity alone. Recognition of pattern continuity. So it is not behaving differently, she said slowly. I am just finally perceiving it without distortion. Dominic's voice remained steady. Yes, he said. The silence that followed was no longer filled with tension. It was filled with alignment. Claire exhaled slowly, her gaze shifting between Dominic and the wolf again, but without fragmentation in her attention. Then what changes in me now, she asked, if distortion is removed? Dominic did not answer immediately. When he did, his tone was quieter, but absolute in clarity. You stop interpreting reality as separate events, he said. Claire absorbed the statement without resistance, as if the structure of it was already integrating into her awareness. And I begin to see it as one continuous system, she said. Dominic nodded once. Yes, he said. The wolf adjusted its position slightly again, but this time the movement was almost imperceptible, as if it was confirming stability rather than initiating change. Claire noticed that too, not as action, but as consistency. It does not feel like it is reacting anymore, she said quietly. Dominic corrected her again. It is not reacting anymore, he said. It is stabilized. Claire looked at him for a long moment, then back at the wolf. And this stabilization is what you meant by recognition, she said. Dominic held her gaze. Yes, he said. Claire paused, her voice lowering slightly. So there is nothing left to reveal, she said. Dominic did not deny it. That absence of denial carried a weight that felt final in structure, not in emotion. The cabin remained still, but the stillness now had definition. It was no longer the stillness of waiting or uncertainty. It was the stillness of something that had completed its transition from separate perception into unified awareness, where nothing inside the space needed to change position anymore in order to be understood. The cabin no longer felt like a space holding uncertainty or discovery. It felt like a space where discovery had already completed its first stage, and what remained was the stabilization of understanding across all present awareness. Claire Whitmore stood very still now, not because she was overwhelmed, but because movement no longer felt necessary for comprehension. Something within her perception had settled into continuity, as if fragmented interpretation had finally merged into a single consistent framework. Dominic Blackwell remained where he was, his presence no longer divided between observation and restraint. It was unified now, as if his awareness and control were no longer competing processes, but synchronized functions of the same understanding. The black wolf stood between them, no longer shifting, no longer adjusting, not because it had stopped responding, but because there was nothing left that required correction. Claire finally spoke, her voice calm, but carrying a depth of alignment that had not been present earlier. If everything is stabilized now, she said slowly, then why does it feel like there should still be something changing? Dominic did not answer immediately. His gaze remained steady, not on her alone, but on the continuity between her awareness and the wolf's stillness, as if confirming that all variables had reached equilibrium. Because transition creates expectation of continuation, he said finally. Claire frowned slightly, not in confusion, but in careful reflection of the idea. And if continuation is no longer necessary, she asked, then what remains? Dominic's voice remained even, but quieter than before. What remains is structure without instability, he said. The wolf shifted its head slightly at that exact moment, not as reaction, but as confirmation of maintained alignment. Claire noticed it, but this time she did not interpret it as movement. She interpreted it as consistency. It does not feel like separate entities anymore, she said quietly. Dominic nodded once. It is no longer processed as separate, he said. Claire repeated the phrasing under her breath. No longer processed as separate, she said. She looked at the wolf again, then back at Dominic, and for the first time, there was no visible effort in her attention. It flowed without interruption. So this is what you meant by recognition completing, she said slowly. Dominic held her gaze. Yes, he said. Claire exhaled softly, her shoulders no longer carrying tension that needed adjustment. Then there is no distinction left to interpret, she said. Dominic did not correct her. That absence of correction was final in structure rather than emotional in tone. The silence that followed was no longer anticipatory. It was resolved. The wolf remained exactly where it was, but its presence no longer felt like an independent element in the space. It felt like confirmation of a system that had completed its alignment phase. Claire stood quietly for a long moment, then spoke once more, her voice steady and fully integrated into the rhythm of the moment. Then what comes after recognition? She asked. If nothing is separate anymore. Dominic paused. Briefly, not in uncertainty, but in acknowledgement of completion. After recognition, he said finally, there is only continuation without division. Claire absorbed the statement without resistance. Not because she fully defined it, but because nothing within her perception contradicted it anymore. The cabin remained still, but the stillness no longer carried progression or anticipation. It carried completion, not of movement, not of events, but of separation itself, where everything present existed no longer as parts trying to connect, but as a single continuous awareness finally no longer divided into interpretation. The cabin was no longer a place where questions were forming. It had become a place where questions had already dissolved into structure, leaving only the quiet continuity of understanding that no longer required translation. Claire Whitmore stood in the center of that stillness, not as someone trying to interpret what was happening anymore, but as someone moving within it without resistance. Something in her perception had fully settled, as if every fragment of confusion had been absorbed into a single continuous awareness that no longer separated experience into parts. Dominic Blackwell remained where he had been since the beginning of the shift, his presence steady, not exerting control over the space, but aligned with it, as if control itself had become unnecessary. The black wolf stood between them, unmoving, not because it was restrained, but because movement itself no longer served a function within the system they were all part of. Claire finally spoke, her voice calm and unbroken, not emerging from thought, but from continuity. So there is nothing left that is outside this, she said slowly. Dominic did not answer immediately. His gaze remained steady, but there was no longer evaluation in it. Only confirmation of completion. There was never anything outside it, he said finally. Claire nodded slightly, as if the statement did not introduce new information, but simply completed something already forming within her awareness. Then everything I thought was separate was only separation in perception, she said. Dominic's voice remained even. Separation was never structural, he said. Only interpretive. The wolf shifted its head once, subtly, not as reaction, but as confirmation of stabilized alignment. Claire noticed it, but her attention no longer fragmented toward it. It was part of the same continuity she was now experiencing without interruption. It feels like there is no beginning or end to what I am perceiving now, she said quietly. Dominic nodded once. There is no segmentation in what you are aligned with, he said. Claire repeated the idea under her breath, not as question, but as integration. No segmentation, she said. She looked at the wolf again, then at Dominic, and for the first time there was no sense of distinction in how she registered them. Not emotionally, not intellectually, but structurally. Then this is what you meant when you said continuation without division, she said. Dominic held her gaze. Yes, he said. The silence that followed was not absence of communication. It was communication without interruption, without transition between understanding and expression. The wolf remained exactly where it was, but its presence no longer functioned as indicator or variable. It functioned as confirmation of stability within the same continuous field of awareness. Claire stood very still, not because she was processing anything further, but because there was nothing left requiring processing in the way she had once understood it. So there is no further step, she said softly. Dominic paused only briefly, not in uncertainty, but in acknowledgement of final structure. There is no further separation to resolve, he said. Claire exhaled slowly, her expression calm, fully aligned with what was present rather than what was being interpreted. Then everything that remains is already part of what this is, she said. Dominic nodded once. Everything, he said. The cabin remained still, but the stillness no longer suggested waiting, change, or transition. It suggested completion without termination, continuity without division, and presence without fragmentation, where nothing inside the space existed apart from the system that had fully recognized itself through all three of them at once.